David's heart sank as he stared at the unfamiliar name on his wife's phone. Mike, can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. The message was short, but it hit him like a sledgehammer. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Rachel had always been protective of her phone, brushing off his occasional jokes about her secrecy as paranoia. Now he realized there was something to hide. It wasn't like David to snoop, but when Rachel had left her phone on the kitchen counter and stepped into the shower, something told him to look. It wasn't intuition, it was more like a gut punch of doubt that he couldn't ignore anymore. For months, she'd been distant, brushing off his attempts to connect with excuses about work stress and being tired. He had chalked it up to the monotony of their 10-year marriage, but now the pieces were falling into place. The message wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't innocent. David's hands shook as he put the phone back, careful to leave everything as it was. He felt the heat of anger rise in his chest, but it wasn't time to confront her, not yet. He needed proof. The next few days were a blur of calculated observations. Rachel's behavior, once seemingly normal, now stood out like flashing neon signs. Late nights at the office. New clothes she claimed were work-related, and a sudden obsession with going to the gym. All things he had dismissed before now felt like glaring red flags. David didn't confront her right away. Instead, he took the time to do what he did best: analyze and strategize. He dug through their shared bank account, noticing charges at restaurants he'd never heard of, and one for a boutique hotel downtown. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. On Friday, she told him she'd be out late again. Client dinner, she said, her voice nonchalant as she kissed him on the cheek and grabbed her purse. David smiled, playing the role of the oblivious husband, but as soon as she left, he grabbed his keys and followed her. She didn't go to the office. She didn't go to a restaurant. Instead, she drove straight to that boutique hotel. David parked a block away and watched as a tall, athletic man greeted her by the entrance. They hugged like old lovers, her face lighting up in a way David hadn't seen in years. When they disappeared inside, David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The rage in his chest was almost unbearable, but he forced himself to stay calm. He snapped a few photos with his phone, a bitter reminder of the woman he thought he knew. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. Not yet. The weekend passed in a haze. Rachel acted as if nothing had happened, laughing during dinner and scrolling through her phone while they watched TV. David played along, biting his tongue and pretending everything was fine. He wanted her to feel comfortable, to let her guard down. By Monday, David had a plan. He hired a private investigator to gather everything he couldn't. It wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about making sure she couldn't twist this around on him. Rachel had always been cunning, and he knew she'd try to justify her actions or paint him as the problem. He wasn't going to let that happen. The investigator worked quickly. By the end of the week, David had a folder full of damning evidence, photos of Rachel and her lover meeting at hotels, time-stamped records of her lies, and even videos of them together in public. It was undeniable. David stared at the folder for hours that night, sitting alone in his office. A part of him wanted to throw it all away and pretend he didn't know, but he couldn't. The betrayal was too deep, too painful to ignore. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the life they had built together, the trust she had shattered, and the future she had stolen from him. The next morning, he called his lawyer. David sat at the dining room table, his laptop open in front of him. Rachel was upstairs, humming to herself as she got ready for another late meeting. The folder of evidence lay next to him, its contents meticulously organized. He'd gone through every photo, every timestamp, every receipt. There was no denying what he had found. He could hear her footsteps coming down the stairs, each one tightening the knot in his stomach. "Hey," she said, walking into the kitchen and grabbing her coat. "Don't wait up. It might run late tonight." David didn't respond right away. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, watching her with an expression that made her pause. "Where are you really going, Rachel?" Her hand froze mid-reach for her keys. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes wary. "You heard me," he said, his voice steady but ice cold. "Where are you going?" "To work," she replied, forcing a smile. "I told you, I have a meeting." David stood up, towering over her as he grabbed the folder from the table. A meeting at the boutique hotel with Mike. He slammed the folder onto the counter, the papers spilling out. Or is that just your new idea of work? Rachel's face went pale, her confident demeanor crumbling in an instant. David, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me, he snapped, his voice rising. I've got everything right here. Pictures, receipts, videos. Don't you dare stand there and lie to me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at the papers, her face a mix of shock and fear. I can explain. Explain what? David barked, his anger bubbling over. That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been sleeping with some random guy while I've been here, trying to hold this marriage together? It's not what it looks like, she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. Oh, spare me the tears, he cut her off. You're not the victim here, Rachel. You've been lying to my face for months. She took a step back, her hands trembling. David, please, just let me explain. Fine, he said, crossing his arms. Go ahead, explain. Tell me why you thought it was okay to destroy everything we built together. Rachel wiped at her tears, trying to compose herself. I've been unhappy, she said quietly, for a long time. Unhappy, David repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decide sleeping with someone else is the solution. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. That's the best you've got, he said, shaking his head. It just happened? Like you tripped and fell into bed with him? Do you even hear yourself? Rachel's tears turned into sobs, but David wasn't moved. He had spent too many nights questioning himself, wondering if he was the problem. Now, he knew the truth, and her excuses only fueled his anger. I was lonely, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible. And that's my fault, David shot back. Do you know how hard I've been working to give us a good life? To make sure we're secure? While you were off playing house with Mike, I was here, busting my ass for us. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what else to do. You didn't know what else to do, David repeated, his voice rising again. How about talking to me? How about being honest? Or was that too much effort? Rachel didn't respond. She stood there, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her actions was finally sinking in. David stared at her, his anger simmering just below the surface. He wanted to scream, to throw something, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. I'm done, he said finally, his voice cold and resolute. I'm not going to be the guy who sits around and waits for you to decide if I'm good enough. You made your choice, Rachel. Now you can live with it. David, please, she begged, reaching for his arm. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. He pulled his arm away, his expression hard. You don't get to decide that. You threw this away the moment you walked into that hotel with him. I'll end it, she said desperately. I'll cut him off. I'll go to therapy. Whatever you want, I'll do it. David shook his head, his jaw clenched. It's too late. You didn't just betray me, Rachel. You betrayed the life we built, the trust we had. And I'm not going to waste another second on someone who doesn't respect me. Rachel collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. David watched her for a moment, his heart aching despite his anger. He had loved her once, more than anything. But the woman sitting in front of him wasn't the same person he had married. And he couldn't ignore that. I've already contacted a lawyer, he said, his voice firm. I'll be filing for divorce. You'll hear from them soon. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. David, no. Please don't do this. We can fix this. I'll prove it to you. There's nothing left to fix, he said, his tone final. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Rachel to sob into her hands. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The life he had known was over, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers David had left for her. The morning light streamed through the window, casting a harsh glare on the pages that spelled out the end of her marriage. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, her eyes scanning the cold, legal language. It felt unreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake from. The front door slammed and Rachel jumped, her heart racing. David entered, carrying a box under his arm. He didn't look at her as he set it down on the counter. His movements were brisk, deliberate, lacking any of the warmth she had once taken for granted. "What's that?" she asked, her voice small. "Your stuff," he said flatly, not bothering to meet her gaze. "The things I found in the office." Rachel frowned, confused. "What do you mean, my stuff?" David opened the box and began removing items one by one. A scarf she'd left draped over a chair weeks ago, a notebook she used for work, and then the kicker, a framed photo of her and Mike, taken at what looked like a restaurant patio. Her breath caught in her throat. "I found this in your drawer," David said, holding the picture up. His voice was calm, but the fury in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "Care to explain why you thought it was a good idea to keep this in our house?" Rachel's face flushed with shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. David tossed the photo onto the table, the glass cracking slightly on impact. "Pathetic," he muttered. "You didn't even try to hide it." "David, Save it," he snapped, cutting her off. "You already said everything I needed to hear the other night. I'm not interested in whatever excuse you've cooked up now." She rubbed her temples, trying to steady herself. "I'm not making excuses. I don't know why I kept that. Maybe I felt guilty. Maybe I was trying to remind myself of my mistakes." "Oh, so you're the victim now," David laughed bitterly. "Don't try to twist this into some sob story about your guilt. You made your bed, Rachel, and from the looks of it, you enjoyed lying in it." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but David didn't flinch. He grabbed the rest of the items from the box and slammed them onto the table. "You left these little breadcrumbs everywhere," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you think I wouldn't notice, or did you just not care?" "I didn't want this to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to lose you." David leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "You didn't lose me. You threw me away. And for what? Some guy who doesn't even have the decency to respect the fact that you're married." Rachel recoiled, his words cutting deeper than she thought possible. She reached out, but David stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice shaky. "But I love you, David. I've always loved you." "Don't say that," he said sharply. "You don't get to say that. Not after everything you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel wiped her tears, desperate to find a way to salvage what little remained of their relationship. "What do you want me to do?" she asked softly. "Tell me, and I'll do it." David let out a hollow laugh. "What I want is for you to be the person I thought I married. But that person doesn't exist anymore, does she?" Her shoulders slumped, the weight of his words crushing her. She had no idea how to respond, no idea how to undo the damage she'd caused. "There's nothing you can do," David said, his tone final. "I've already made my decision, and for once it's not about you, it's about me." Rachel's head shot up, her eyes pleading. "Just give me one chance to prove to you that I can change. Please, David." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You had your chance. You had 10 years of chances, and you blew it." As he turned to leave, Rachel's desperation boiled over. "You can't just throw everything away like this," she cried, her voice rising. "We have a history, a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" David stopped in the doorway, his back still turned. "It did," he said quietly, "but not anymore." And with that, he walked out, leaving Rachel alone with her shattered reality. She sat there for hours, staring at the divorce papers. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence oppressive. When her phone buzzed on the table, she grabbed it instinctively. It was a message from Mike. "Thinking of you. Miss you." Her stomach churned as she stared at the words. For the first time, she felt nothing but disgust, not at him, but at herself. She deleted the message without responding, the gesture feeling both futile and too little, too late. Meanwhile, David was at his lawyer's office, finalizing the paperwork. His expression was calm, but his clenched fists betrayed the storm raging inside him. As much as he hated Rachel for what she'd done, he also hated himself for not seeing the signs sooner. "You're doing the right thing," his lawyer said, handing him the finalized documents. David nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." When he left the office, the winter air hit him like a slap to the face. But instead of feeling cold, he felt something he hadn't in months: freedom. He had lost the woman he thought he'd spend the rest of his life with, but in the process he had found something far more valuable: himself. David walked into the house, a box in his hand labeled Rachel's backup laptop. It had been sitting in the garage for months, forgotten amidst the clutter. He had planned to donate it once, but now it served a different purpose. He placed it on the kitchen counter, his jaw tense as he prepared to see what secrets it might hold. Rachel was out, likely at her sister's, where she'd been staying on and off since the confrontation. David used the quiet to his advantage, powering up the old laptop. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the nagging feeling that there was more to uncover wouldn't let him rest. The desktop loaded, and as he navigated through the folders, he stumbled across one labeled personal. Inside were archived emails, photos, and documents. One email chain in particular caught his eye. It was from Mike. The subject line read "Trip Details." David clicked on it, his heart pounding in his chest. The email was dated months before the confrontation. Mike had sent Rachel details about a weekend getaway they had planned. The location, a secluded cabin in the mountains, was one David had suggested they visit a year ago. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. They hadn't just had an affair, they had stolen moments that were supposed to belong to him and Rachel. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Rachel. "Can we talk tomorrow? Please." David stared at the message, his grip tightening on the phone. He didn't respond. Instead, he scrolled through the rest of the emails, his anger building with each one. The getaway wasn't the only thing they had shared. There were exchanges about their plans for the future, conversations filled with intimacy and inside jokes, things Rachel had once shared with him. He slammed the laptop shut, pacing the kitchen as his thoughts raced. Just as he began to formulate his next move, the front door opened. Rachel stepped inside, her expression unsure as she spotted him. "David," she said cautiously, setting her purse down. "I thought you'd be out." "I bet you did." His tone was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "But I've been busy discovering just how much of my life you've hijacked." Rachel froze, her eyes darting to the laptop on the counter. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Rachel. David spat, pulling the chair out and sitting down with an air of control she hadn't seen before. "The cabin, the emails, you and Mike planning a future while I was sitting here like an idiot, thinking we had one." Her face went pale, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. "Sit down," David ordered, pointing to the chair across from him. She hesitated but obeyed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. It wasn't like that she began, her voice trembling. "We didn't plan a future." "Don't," David interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. Her flinch made him pause, but it didn't douse the fire in his chest. "Don't sit there and try to rewrite what's in black and white. I've read it all, Rachel. Every disgusting word." Tears welled in her eyes, but David wasn't moved. He leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You took something we talked about, a trip I wanted to take with you, and you gave it to him. Do you have any idea how sick that is?" Her tears spilled over, but she shook her head, trying to explain. It wasn't about. "Stop lying," David shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "I'm done with your excuses. I'm done with you making this out to be anything other than what it is: selfish, disgusting betrayal." "I know I messed up," Rachel sobbed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I know I hurt you, but I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean to," David laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You've been meaning to for months, Rachel. Don't insult me by pretending this was some accident." "I was lost," she cried. "I didn't know how to fix us, and Mike was." "Convenient? Exciting? What, Rachel? What was he?" David's voice cut through her attempts to justify. "Because he sure as hell wasn't your husband." Rachel dropped her face into her hands, her sobs muffled by her palms. David stood, pacing the room as the weight of her actions pressed down on him. "You thought I wouldn't find out," he said, his voice quieter but no less intense. "You thought you could play both sides? That I'd just keep being your safety net while you live this double life?" "I didn't want to lose you," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, you did," David said coldly. "And now you're going to have to deal with the fallout." He walked to the counter, grabbing the divorce papers he had updated with his lawyer earlier that day. He tossed them onto the table in front of her. "You're going to sign those," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "No arguments, no stalling. I'm done." Rachel stared at the papers, her tears dripping onto the pages. "David, please. We can go to counseling. We can." "No," he said firmly. "Counseling won't fix this. You can't fix this because you didn't just break my trust, you destroyed everything we were." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I love you." David scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't get to say that anymore. Not when you've spent months showing me the exact opposite." Rachel reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his expression hard. "Don't touch me." "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice small and defeated. "You go wherever you want," David said, his voice steady. "But it won't be with me. I'm moving on without you." He turned and walked to the door, grabbing his coat. Rachel called after him, but he didn't stop. As he stepped out into the cold night air, he felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally taking back control of his life.